Well, hello, and we are about to undertake how it is that we understand what life is actually made up of. And if you're on this planet and you're part of the solar system and you're part of this universe, you're made up of matter. And matter is anything that occupies space and has a mass. And everything that's composed inside of matter can be broken down by literally separating the individual pieces of matter from one another, such that you can learn that there are unique forms of matter with specific chemical properties and specific physical properties. And the chemical properties will be each of those atoms that will be added together to create that specific material, and then how it behaves on that planet, in this solar system, in this universe. Okay, so each of these things that we're going to call life is made up of these building blocks, and those building blocks right now, in terms of like introduction, are simply matter. So what is it then? Well, you've made it to college, which means you understand that there are elements, and elements that have cooled as they exited the sun to be additive. And by that I mean each element can be broken down into smaller substances. And this isn't, unfortunately, a physics class where we should go into how all of these things are actually built, or even a chemistry class, which is a little bit more easy for you to understand why we rearrange them the way we rearrange them, and they're given their specific names. But what you can learn if you sort of take a step back and go, oh, broad stroke, if I looked at all living organisms on the face of the planet and I wanted to know what the four most common elements were, you'd find out that they're built primarily around carbon. That carbon will then have some ratio of oxygen, hydrogen, nitrogen, and every other thing that can be found on the planet inside of each one of those living organisms. Depending upon where that living organism is found, you're going to find that these ratios change. Okay? But we're going to use these four really basic structures to build the macromolecules that are required to build, say, organelles. And those organelles will be found inside of cells. And those cells will be used to make tissues. And those tissues will be used to make organ systems, and as a result of the organ that's being built. And as we go along in this line of complexity, you're going to see that each of these has a specific responsibility. And that's what you really want to start thinking about. If you can work it backwards, it means that carbon's going to do something specific. Oxygen, hydrogen, and nitrogen. And it isn't just that you want to learn, oh, the four most common elements of living organisms are carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. You want to think to yourself, hey, this instructor is going to have me understand why Mother Nature used carbon instead of something else. Or what's the purpose of actually understanding what oxygen can actually do? Because even though you need oxygen to live, this is some really dangerous material. When we actually look at this inside human life, you can see that oxygen makes up most of 65% of the material that's found inside of a human life. Okay? So this is humans that are alive. This is the element as you find it. You can see the atmosphere is pretty replete with oxygen. It's not so replete with carbon dioxide, which is kind of cool. But when you look inside human bodies, 18% of the body is made up of carbon in different forms. Carbon by itself is different than carbon dioxide, but it's still part of carbon we find inside of humans. Nitrogen, although it makes up most of the atmosphere, okay, is going to be found as an inert gas, and inside of your body you can't have that much of it. So what's actually happening here is you are seeing how the forces that are required to create life take what's present either in the atmosphere or the crust, okay, and then reconfigure it so that it has this ratio here. Well, that's a really big idea. It means there's going to have to be a series of machines that are going to take it out of the atmosphere or out of the crust and now turn it into what you think life is. Okay? And that, I don't know, if that doesn't blow your mind, there isn't going to be much in this class that does. But if you just look outside your window, or if you have a pet, just look at your pet. Whatever you feed that animal, okay, or whatever you feed yourself, those materials have to be reconfigured into this ratio of oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, and nitrogen such that you can live. Now, when we're thinking about what it's being reconfigured from and to and all of that, we need to even take a step further back from that and just remind everybody that an atom is the smallest unit of matter that retains all the chemical properties of an individual element. So the atom of carbon has characteristics. You will need to learn them. You can see that the atom has two regions. It has a nucleus and has these electrons. For the purpose of our class, oh my God, you need to make sure that protons, neutrons, and electrons are individually subatomic particles, and there are many more than this. Muons, gluons, right-handed muons, left-handed muons. There are many things that we never discuss inside of this class, but you don't have to know them to understand that every single atom has a nucleus, and that nucleus is made up of protons and neutrons. When you take them apart, then you learn some interesting things. What we do need to understand are those electrons are going to be what we use to undertake chemical reactions. And I'm sure you understand that already, but just to make sure, these guys, protons and neutrons, are pretty much maintaining the major mass of the atom. The electrons are doing all of the heavy lifting in terms of who interacts with whom and when. The key properties of all subatomic particles are protons are positively charged, neutrons are not charged, and electrons are negatively charged. And we're going to find them winging around, being held in place by some fantastic forces that allow these electrons that essentially are negative in mass or absence in mass, but actually have a charge, and therefore they can enter into chemical reactions. And one thing to think about is this is a schematic of what a helium element would actually look like. On the protons and the neutrons, you can see the protons are positively charged, neutrons no charge. The sum makes up the nucleus. And then the interactions of charge keep these things that are called electrons swinging around. And because there are two of them, these guys are stable and they are happy and they don't need to figure out what's going on around them. Helium is a specific gas, and we use it for different things that are unique to human consumption, but Mother Nature made helium gas independent of our understanding of it. And that's a really important concept because more often than not, students learn these things in terms of why I know it, sort of associatively. But here's something to comprehend. As all of that matter was cooling from the sun as we exploded after our sun exploded. Okay? And by that I mean we're now spinning around. As this is cooling, this is a stable form of those protons and neutrons and the electrons that are flying around it. And they don't have to interact with anything else. Okay? The atoms of each element have a standard number of protons and electrons. Okay? And the thing that will change then will be the number of neutrons, and that's going to give us the atomic mass. So if its atomic number is the number of protons, that's the sort of important thing you need to pay attention to. Make sure you understand the definition of. Okay, each element has a distinct atomic number, and we do this because we like to categorize things and make sure we understand how our world works. Now, the atomic mass is the mass of the atom, which is roughly equal to the number of protons and neutrons. And that's when things get weird, right? Because I just told you a moment ago, not all elements have the same number of neutrons. And when that varies, you have a natural population of differences that we collectively call isotopes. So the atomic mass is expressed as the atomic mass unit. And what happens, of course, is then you just get these populations of the differences. Here's an example. Carbon has an atomic number of 6, and two stable isotopes that we can look at are 12 and 13. Okay, and we use carbon-13 for all sorts of cool things. Your textbook will talk about how we carbon date, yada, yada, yada. But we also use it for other things inside of biochemistry labs. But the idea, of course, is it's unstable, and therefore it's trying to get to its normal, or whatever normal looks like, less reactive state. Now, what happens is the mass atomic number, as a result of all of the ratios of these that are found in the crust or in our atmosphere, gives the atomic mass at approximately 12.11. You'll never have to calculate this. you need to understand why this is an isotope of that. Okay. So, here's one that we do use inside the lab all the time. We use tritium to mark how the hydrogen protons are changing. I should say the presence of hydrogen is changing inside of cells that are growing. Okay, we intercalate it into the DNA of cells and you watch as they grow. And because it is unstable, it releases energy, and that energy we can use to detect changes in where it's located. So you can see here that this is the normal protium. Deuterium has 2 and tritium has 3 neutrons, and this is trying to behave like protium here. Okay, so Mother Nature again is going to change these populations depending upon where we are, and that's how we use them. I should say that's how Mother Nature uses them. When you look at all of the elements summed together, many people have come up with different ways of doing this, but a Russian chemist, Mendeleev, came up with this prioritization and periodic table that goes from groups 1 through 18, 1 being highly unstable, 17 being highly unstable, and 18 being stable. And in between these, we actually break them down into their color code. Here we'll tell you that they're other nonmetals versus alkali metals versus transition metals, and we're not a chemistry class, so we don't really care about that. Instead, what we do is you just take a step back, you take a look at how Mother Nature utilizes each of these inside living organisms. You'll see that's actually fairly important when I start describing you as a bag of salt water. Because that's really all you are, and that changing of that bag of salt water and the elements inside of it will change the behavior of whatever's inside of you as well. And one way to think about this is most atoms have a neutral charge. Niels Bohr came up with this really early model that actually was based upon how we thought of our solar system, where the nucleus would be the sun and you'd have the celestial bodies swinging around it. And what Niels thought was, hey, I have this idea that there are sort of very low mass charged particles that are flying around the nucleus here. And he was right. Okay, so way back early 1900s, right through the mid 1900s, most of the physics that was done to demonstrate this would show that depending upon how large the nucleus was, you change the number of electrons that were then swinging around this. So every single atom has its own orbits, and inside of those orbits you have the electrons that fill think about them as sort of like the atmosphere surrounding the nucleus. And there's a series of rules that govern this, and that's more for positional chemistry and physical chemistry for us to worry about. The one that we care about is the outermost ring, okay? Because Mother Nature fills them from first to second to third, but that means they're full, and it means they can't interact with other electrons. Only the outermost ring, or valence electrons, can interact with other electrons. So your textbook sort of digresses into how these are all filled. You can see here that group 1 has 1 electron flying around, and that's not stable. I told you it's highly reactive. Inside period 2, you can see that there's 1 electron flying around out here, and period 3, group 1, you can see 1 electron as well. And you can see there's hydrogen, lithium, and sodium, and each of these represents highly reactive elements. Likewise, we flip over here to 17, which I also said was highly reactive for you. You can see that this is missing 1 electron. Okay, so it is 2, 4, 6, 7, 2, 4, 6, 7. And I'm describing it this way because when you look at group 18, you can see that the valence shells are filled. Okay, and this is why they're described as stable. Helium has 2, neon has 2, 4, 6, 8. Argon has 2, 4, 6, 8 when you're looking out at the outermost ring. Now you'll notice there's something hinky going on here inside this cartoon. 2, 4, 6, and it looks like they're supposed to be 7, but I mean, there are supposed to be 8 here. Somebody didn't do their art properly. Okay. Now, what do we do with this information? Well, if this is stable and these are unstable, the only way you can get to stable is to begin to mix them together. And remember, I told you you're nothing but a bag of salt water. And guess what? Look, here's salt, 1 electron here, chloride here. Sodium chloride is what salt water is made up of. And you can see that when we allow them to come together and we remove water, you form the crystalline salt, much like you put on your French fries when and if you ever get to go out and eat food. Okay, so what does that tell us? Well, it's not a complete understanding of how it works. And again, I'm not going to spend any time thinking about the quantum mechanics of physical chemistry here that can predict where the electrons might be going to in any of those elements. What I want to make sure you understand is that how they interact is more important. And Mother Nature's already solved this problem for us, because in these last couple of minutes here, you're going to see that all chemical reactions are made up of a series of reactants that will have something happen to them. And that something that's happening to them is going to be a change in pressure, be a change in temperature, could be a change in concentration. And each of these can be facilitated by a catalyst. Something will change how the reactants interact with one another, and more importantly, the electrons of the reactants, such that you end up with 2 unique sets of products. Okay? So, having told you that, let's get rid of that there. If we go back, let's go back one more, you can see that if we have reactants, we can then describe the types of chemical reactions that will give us those different products. And your textbook starts off with irreversible reactions, meaning that it only goes in one way. Once you actually have 2 hydrogen peroxides, you're going to break that down into 2 water molecules and 2 oxygen molecules. And we're going to stop here on this slide, and I'll pick up in this slide inside the next step. But I want to come back to how you know this is how this works. Likewise, you have bicarbonate here, and in the presence of a hydrogen proton, this can actually be a reversible reaction. And in fact, this reversible reaction is what keeps you alive. Okay, it's also part of a different set of reactions. But for right now, what I'm hoping you're going to see is, let's take a look. You've got a couple of hydrogens, you got some oxygens. Look, we even thrown a carbon here, but notice all we're doing is using the electrons of whatever these reactants are to make now new product. That's a pretty good place to stop for this part. And I'm going to, because once these things get too long, people stop listening. So I'm going to stop here and I'm going to make the next one.